Hello.
Hello, welcome everybody.
Hello.
I'm going to give our panelists a few minutes to get on, and then I'm going to open the broadcast to attendees.
Okay.
Can everybody hear me okay, and everybody else okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. Ramsey, you good? Great. Looks like we got Kevin joining us, and we've got a couple more people. We'll wait to get on, and then I'll start broadcasting everything. So how's everybody feeling?
Great.
Awesome.
I'm okay. How are you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. My first time doing one of these, so y'all bear with me, but it's a learning experience, which is always a good thing. All right. Looks like I'm still waiting on a couple more people. We'll just give a couple more minutes and then we'll start. And we've still got about 3 minutes before 6 o'clock. So.
Sure.
Okay.
Hey, Kevin, good to see you again. Kevin, I don't know if you can hear me or not, but good to see you again. There you go.
All right. Good evening, everybody.
Hey, Kevin.
Hello. Good evening. Hi, Joe. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I was just telling everyone, welcoming everybody, and I'm going to open the broadcast in just a moment. I'm just waiting on one more panelist to join.
Okay.
So thank you all so much for giving every evening for this. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Hey, let me ask you, can you all hear the speaker going off in the other room here? Okay, y'all can hear me. Okay. All right. I ain't gonna worry about it then.
Think you're good.
Got thin walls here at IB10.
Understand.
How many folks do you have signed up?
We have about 35 people that are going to be joining us. So we have our volunteers as well as some of our staff and some of our board members are going to be joining us today too.
Great.
So,
Great.
yeah. Does anyone have any final questions before I open things up?
No, I don't think so. I know we're going to wind this up very promptly at 7 o'clock, so I'll be very mindful of that.
Yes, sir. All right. Yeah, we want to make sure we're respectful of everybody's time tonight. So, well, I'm going to go ahead and open the broadcast and we'll get started. So, good luck, everyone. Thank you. All right. Hello and welcome to Big Brothers, Big Sisters of Kentuckiana. My name is Andrea Renstell, and I am the Volunteer Outreach and Engagement Manager with our program, along with being our training coordinator. I'm here today with several panelists. We're going to be talking about the Big Talk on Race. So thank you all so much for signing up for this. This is going to be the first in a series of webinars we're going to be hosting for individuals in our program. This panel discussion today is being recorded and will be available for others to view at a later date. All audience members have been muted. You'll be able to share your questions in our chat box feature. And then our panelists, I'm going to ask you to mute unless you are sharing with the group, just so that way we can alleviate background noise. Big Brothers, Big Sisters, we recognize that in the past few months in particular, there's been a lot of a time of racial injustice and concerns. So people in the audience today may be wondering how to address this with your little and their family, how to talk with them about this and how they're being affected by it, but you just aren't sure how to ask or talk with them. So today we're going to be hearing from 5 panelists on this topic. All of them are Big Brother and Big Sister mentors in our program. We have Kevin Williams, community-based Big Brother, Christian Dujan, community-based Big Sister, Ramsey Sabri, School to Work Big Brother, Jennifer Ortiz, community-based Big Sister, and Joe Bargione, a site-based Big Brother. So welcome everyone, thank you. Panelists are going to be asked a series of questions at the end or during this time by our moderator. There's going to be a time for questions from the audience at the end as well. We're going to end today promptly at 7. We want to make sure we're respectful of all of your all's time, which is why we began promptly at 6. And our moderator today is Tom Johnson. So Tom is a versatile corporate communications leader. He's got 35 years of experience serving with both for and nonprofit organizations. He most recently served as Vice President, Public Relations, and Chief Communications Officer for Norton Healthcare here in Louisville. And over the span of his career, he has directed the development of media relations, public relations, internal communications, and crisis communications programs across multiple industries, including healthcare, insurance, clinical laboratories, financial services, pharmaceutical, and automotive. He's a Philadelphia native. Tom is a former board member for Metro United Way here in Louisville and is a past big brother for us. I actually used to support his match on my caseload years ago. And he's also a former board chair for our Kentuckiana office. So Tom, thank you so much for being here with us today and being willing to be moderator for us. And I'm going to turn it over to you now to begin our panel discussion. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Andrea. And let me say thank you to the rest of the panelists and thank you to all the big brothers and big sisters who are tuning in to hear this. And I know those of us who may be old enough to remember the early days of the civil rights movement can remember how tumultuous those times were and the times how fearful those times were. But I'm thinking about the fact that our littles have probably never seen anything like this in their lives. So I'm certain that they are full of fear, they're full of confusion, and we as big brothers and big sisters have a responsibility to them to try to help them through this situation, to deal with this and come out of it the other end still whole human beings. So let me thank Big Brothers and Big Sisters Kentuckiana for putting this forward. And I'd like to just start by making a quick statement that in my own experience with this has been, especially with the most recent examples of the social unrest and the conversations that have resulted because of that, people are shocked when I explain to them that I too have experienced racial injustice and experienced systemic racism. And they're surprised because the first reaction is, but Tom, you're one of the good guys. So how is this possible that it happens to you? And they're shocked to realize that this has been happening for years and it still happens today. And when it does happen, no one knows who you are other than what you look like or what you appear to them to be. So let me start by just asking some of the panelists for your own, any examples that you want to share, either past or maybe fairly recently, of systemic racism that maybe you've experienced. And I'll throw that open to any one of our 5 panelists here.
So, thank you, Tom. I'll be happy to share. My name is Ramsey Sabri, like the introduction said. I am a Louisville native. I grew up in the west end of Louisville and the Smoketown neighborhood. And so there are many instances of structural racism that I've dealt with. One of them, you know, particularly under the context that we are talking at the moment about disproportional violence and aggression towards Black folks. I can remember around the age of 12 or 13 was the first time that I had a police officer pull their weapon on me. So this is just a reality check, like 12, 13 years old, police officer pulls weapon. And, you know, some of you may say like, oh, well, what were you doing? I don't think that any 12 or 13-year-old can be doing much of anything that a police officer should pull their gun on them for. Within that context, so for me in that instance, you know, as a young person who's growing up in the city, and I am dealing with police officers in many aspects. So there are school SROs, there are neighborhood police officers. If I go out, if I go to a party or something, oftentimes there's police officers. It changes the relationship that I have with those authority figures. So Whereas some young people, the same age group, same age that I was at the time, when they saw the police officer, it may mean, oh, this is the friendly officer so-and-so. But to me, it's like, oh, okay, that's that. I wonder if he knows the guy who pulled the gun on me, 12 or 13 years old. So I would use that as an example that relates back to what we are directly back to what we're dealing with at the moment.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Anyone else have anything to add?
So I am Jennifer Ortiz. I'm a criminal justice professor at IU Southeast, but I'm a New York City native. So I grew up around the notoriously racist NYPD. And one of the most vivid memories as a child was being 5 years old and watching my uncle, who was in active addiction at the time, be slammed against the ground by the NYPD and thrown in the back of a police van. And that image is kind of seared in my mind, and it affected the way I viewed police my entire life. But then at 15 years old, the police pulled up alongside me and my then boyfriend and said, "Where are the drugs?" We didn't have any drugs, but they proceeded to throw us against the fence and search both of us. And at 15 years old, being a young lady, having this male officer, what is in my opinion sexually assault me, that made me afraid of police for the rest of my life, and it actually inspired my entire career. And it's why I decided to become a criminal justice professor, was to try to begin to combat those things.
And both of those situations that you both just described, they had to be incredibly frightening for you at the time. So again, we try to transfer that kind of an experience over to what our littles have to be going through today. So just out of curiosity, have any of you any conversations with your littles about what's going on currently? And I know this is pretty much Louisville centric right now, because unfortunately Louisville is sort of a focal point for the whole world. They're paying attention to this issue now for the first time, maybe in a long time. But have any of you had any conversations with your littles about what they've seen, what's going on, and more importantly, how they feel about it?
So my name is Christian Dudgeon. I recently got in contact with my little. Unfortunately, we experienced a little bit of strain over this summer as far as communication goes between COVID and everything else. But recently I spoke to her and I asked her, well, how are you feeling about everything that's going on? Because in my situation, my little doesn't live that far from downtown Louisville. So a lot of the protesting that's happening at 6th and Jefferson regularly, she's not that far removed from it. And I asked her, had she seen protesters herself and things like that? And she was very honest with me. I realized in talking to her that children see what's going on, but they don't always have a full grasp of what's happening and why. And so I asked her, well, how do you feel about protesting and the people who are protesting? And she said, well, I think that if people do something wrong, they should be held accountable, is essentially what she told me. And we had a very short conversation about it. I asked her, it was important for me to ask her about how it affects her emotionally, especially, when I'm listening to my colleagues on the panel talk about interpersonal experiences with systemic racism. I'm very familiar with the subtleties of systemic racism in academia. It's the teachers who are shocked that you are Black or brown and you are intelligent, or they're shocked that you are able to articulate your thoughts well. You go to school with people's children who say that they wish they got a scholarship to college because they're Black, things like that. So I asked her, how it doesn't make you feel to see the Breonna Taylor case in our city and to see all this unfolded. And I think that, candor is just the best policy in those conversations. And that's what worked for us.
And it's interesting that you say that. And Joe, it looked like you're about ready to chime in. I don't want to cut you off, so go right ahead.
I appreciate that. So right now, I'm in a school-based match. So I haven't had the opportunity with COVID hitting in March. All our contacts were being done at school. And so I haven't really had the opportunity to have conversations with my little about that. But just to kind of follow up what Kristen's point is, I used to work in the school system for many years. And so I would see, unfortunately, with some teachers, they were what we call track kids, that there are certain classes, depending on your color, you're more likely to go maybe into the trades rather than the more challenging classes or like the advanced placement classes. And I would see that all the time. And, one of the things as a school administrator, that was one of the things we would have to fight and say, hey, listen, just because the way the person looks, you don't know what's underneath and all the talents that lie underneath. And so that was always a challenge. And there's just one more point about seeing it. Having grown up in New York like Jennifer, even New York's a very diverse state, especially around the city, but there are small communities within the city that are really isolating, just like here in Louisville, like say the East End or the West End. So growing up in the community where I was, it really wasn't until I went to college where I was really among more time around a diverse community, including Black and brown people. And so it was really kind of eye-opening to me because my sphere of influence was like my immediate friends and my family. And it wasn't until college is when my sphere of influence started to grow larger and larger. And I would see with some of the friends when we were in college, how the police would interact with me being a white person versus a friend who was African-American. And so at that point, I started to kind of like, what's going on? And so in the beginning, it was like being more like a bystander. And then I said, well, this isn't right. And so one of the things I did, and I did this over my career, was to look at how can I be an upstander? And so it's really just about, kind of studying and, just kind of learning about how differences aren't bad. Differences are good and diversity is good. It's like a quilt. And then the last point I just want to bring up, and this really rung true to me or kind of broke my heart 4 years ago. In the recent election, a lot of stuff was going on with the immigrants when they were first coming to the United States, and they wanted those people to go back to their country. And I remember I was doing some counseling with this 6-year-old African-American girl, and we were talking, and she was frightened. She goes, are they going to put me back in slavery? And this is a 6-year-old child. And it just struck me that here this little child, 6 years old, is afraid that she and her family are going to go back to being slaves in our community. And that was such an eye-opener to me that said, listen, I got to be a better upstander and less of a bystander. So
it's a shame to hear a young person, especially when they're young, having those kinds of thoughts and fears. But I guess what that points out is what we started out by saying, that our littles have never seen anything like what they're seeing now in their lives. So undoubtedly, they have to have a lot of fear about it. They don't know exactly what to expect, and they don't know what this means for them personally. And I know someone mentioned the whole COVID-19 situation and the difficulty that we all have to be having when we're just keeping contact with our littles at all. But in this circumstance, given what's going on there in Louisville and across the country and around the world, I think we all have to make a concerted effort to reach out, even if it's by telephone, by telegraph, a message in a bottle, however it may be, to somehow get in contact with our littles and maybe have this conversation with them. But those of you who have had specific conversations with your littles about what they're seeing going on around them, has any of your littles expressed maybe some of their own instances where they were treated differently just because of what they look like or where they live?
I'd like to chime in on that. This is Kevin Williams.
Right.
My little is biracial, so he has his internal problems with his own family dynamic. So his father's white, his mother's black, but he stays with his mother. And I don't think his father fully accepts him because basically he disclosed some stuff to me in regards to when he goes to his father's house, he feels like he's the outcast in his own. So I had mother kind of, just discuss race in general. And she was glad I did because she didn't know how to address it being from a male's perspective. So he has challenges because he's very intelligent. He speaks, very proper. So he gets picked on because, he's biracial. And it's pretty sad because I seen him one day cry because some of the friends in his neighborhood don't really relate to him because he speaks very well. And he does it not to belittle anyone. That's just the way he is. He's very intelligent. So he has struggles with that, just being a 10-year-old, which is sad. Because when I talk to him, I think I'm talking to somebody who's in college, because I can use big words and I don't have to tone the conversation down. But he's very interested in why color impacts who you are. And I said, I really can't fully explain that to you, because you'll get it different from your perspective. But from my perspective, yeah, I've been treated differently based on my color. And his mother's, American, and it's like so confusing to him. It's hard for him, but it's a challenge, even as a 10-year-old. And all he wants to do is go play because he's a 10-year-old. That's our challenge. But we talk about race, way before any of his other stuff. When I first met him, I asked his mother, was it okay? Because he was biracial, and they let me know that up front. So I wanted to introduce that as part of our regular conversation.
Well, you actually bring up a very good point, and I think that's something to discuss. And we're talking about now moving into preparing ourselves to be able to have these conversations with our littles about a very difficult topic. So 2 things I want to mention. One, for all the bigs who are listening, to remember that Big Brothers Big Sisters does have resources available to you to help give you information, guidance, background information, not only on your little, but on the topic in general, and maybe how to bring this discussion up. But the other point that you raised was having a conversation with either a parent or a guardian first to make sure you're not going beyond the bounds of what they want in terms of a relationship with their child and their big. So let me ask that question. If anyone has had any conversations with parents about, or guardians about, we see a lot's going on in the neighborhood. I'd like to talk to my little about this. What are your thoughts on this? What have you said? What conversations have you had? And let's reach an agreement so that I'm only talking about the things that we agree in common we should both talk a little about.
So in my experience, my little's parents and I have a very open door to communication. I saw someone in the chat earlier mention that their own race motivated them to become a big because of representation. And I relate to that. That's kind of the reason why I wanted to be a big to a African-American young lady as well. And so I asked before all of this happened, and when we were first matched, I asked her mother how she felt about talking about race, how she felt about talking about some of the unique things that we deal with as minorities. And I'm grateful that my little's parent was very open to those conversations from the beginning, and she's endorsed us continuing to have those conversations even now. But I do also agree that, the parental agreement and comfort has to be considered before you branch into these conversations. And I would also say that personal bias is something you have to evaluate for yourself before you have that conversation as well.
Excellent. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll chime in.
Sorry, Ramsey, I apologize. You go right ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I echo that as a staff member, that we're definitely here for you all if you ever want to talk about that further, or even if you just need somebody just to sit in the moment with it. I think sometimes that we don't have to have all the answers. It's just being there for someone. So we're more than happy to help, whatever the case might be. So thank you. Sorry, Ramsey, go ahead.
That's all good. I'm going to comment and share that we look at the academic body around race-based trauma. We start to talk about the experiences that like people of color or minority people, whatever you want to call them, experience as a whole. But you all can also tie in things like ACEs. You can also tie in the experience that intergenerational experiences. And so as we're talking about speaking to parents about issues of race, these issues that are coming up in the zeitgeist that we're living in, one of the things that you have to be careful about is making sure that, your little is a part of that conversation too. So I'll give an example. My little is African-American, and he was called the N-word by a fellow student, and not in a joking way, but like in a way that is meant to degrade and diminish. And so when this happened at school. The school got on it. They took their path, and to respond to it. And I'm not sure, and I'm not. I didn't necessarily like try to hold them accountable. Before, when he told me, I was ready to roll. Like I was just like, oh, okay, we got this. Like, okay, we're gonna handle this. However, I did ask him first. I said, hey, this is not cool. This is something that I'm a social worker by training. It's something that I've experienced as a Black man. And I was like, well, let me talk to your parents. Do you want me to talk to the school? Do you want me to do X, Y, and Z? And his response was no. My little was in high school. I made sure that he knew I would go that route with him. However, I don't want to diminish our relationship by overstepping bounds. I've been a mentor for a long time, and you don't necessarily know the circumstances that you're stepping into. So you really have to be careful about making sure that you're maintaining your relationship with your little and doing what you're responsible for doing in relationship to reporting stuff to parents and to schools and to whomever, the other stakeholders.
And Ramsey, I think that's a really strong reinforcement for the point that we made, is that this has to be a contract between the parent or guardian, and the young person who's involved, to make sure that you come out on the other end doing some good for the little, but also having all the relationships with parents intact. And I know someone mentioned earlier about having, a couple of you have mentioned having sort of negative interactions with police. And although I lived in Louisville for a number of years, as Andrea mentioned, I'm a Philadelphia native, and I now live outside of the Philadelphia area. And if you've been watching the national news, you realize that right now, Philadelphia is a hotbed, because once again, an African-American man was killed by the police. Now, granted, he has some mental issues, and the response from the police, many would say, was not matched up with the situation they were presented with, and resulted with someone losing their life. So the next question I want to ask is really specific about the relationship that our littles may have, or the feelings they may have toward police. And how do we talk to them about recognizing and realizing what they're seeing in front of them every day in the news, and they're seeing happening in the community and on the news, and hearing their parents and friends talk about it, but at the same time trying to still hold on to some type of a balanced relationship, understanding that not every police officer on the street is a bad police officer, not every cop is a bad cop, and how even the whole concept of having the talk. And many of us have heard about and talked about having the talk with young Black men in particular about how you handle yourself if you are ever confronted by police, or you find yourself in a situation where I didn't expect to be here, but now I'm being confronted by a police officer. So have any of you had any conversations with your little about that topic in particular?
Well, my little is justice involved himself. So he's 13 years old, actively on probation, and recently arrested. And so he has direct criminal justice experience, and needless to say that his views of the police are not very positive because of his arrest. And so part of what I did was go with him to some of his court appearances. Obviously, I can't go into the courtroom because he's a minor, but being there physically with him and trying to explain to him how the justice system works, why it's structured this way, and how he can expect them to react to him, and how he can't control how they react to him, but he can control how he reacts in response to them, as trying to get him to understand that if he were to say something problematic in court, it will be used against him and it will make things worse for him. But then also having conversation with him about why it was that his co-defendants, who were older and white, were allowed to go home that day, and why he, as a half Black, half Mexican, much younger boy, was actually held in jail, was a difficult conversation to have, because obviously he's very angry. He feels, the three of us did this thing and I'm the one sitting in jail. And so having a conversation with him about his race and how that affects the way people view him was more about what he can do in those interactions, and explain to him that he cannot control the way that they react to what he does, but he can control how he reacts, how he responds to their reaction to him. But it's very difficult because it's very difficult to combat the negative mindset he has about them because he's directly involved in the justice system.
Joe, let me ask you, the little that you work with, and I know it's in a school-based program, is that correct?
Yes.
Oh, okay, and have you had any opportunity to either meet or talk at all this year? Because I know, I guess the start of the school year has been pretty spotty with the virus situation.
Yeah, no, actually, we haven't been able to meet since, because he goes to JCPS. And so when they went into that non-traditional learning in March, on March 13th, and they've never come back. So I'm not allowed to have contact with him, and I understand it outside of school. So I've only been able to email him once in a while through our match specialist. Pat's done a wonderful job. And so periodically I'll send him a note, you know, through an email through Pat, and then that goes to my little, but I haven't had any response back yet. So I really haven't had the opportunity to have conversations around what's going on in our community, and, you know, just having not talked to him since before March, almost over a half a year now.
But had you had a chance to meet with or talk with your little prior to this, maybe in the previous year?
Yeah, it didn't, because my current little brother is white. And so it really hasn't come up. He's in an alternative school for different reasons. And so it's really hasn't come up in our to be honest, it hasn't come up in our conversations at this point, up until March anyway.
I guess that kind of brings up an interesting point for me, at least, and that is my own thought that these discussions that we're talking about having with our littles are not specifically just for Black and brown littles, but they should be for everyone, because everyone is witnessing what we're seeing, especially happening in Louisville, but around the world. So, Joe, I hate to put you on the spot, but I just want to ask if you would feel comfortable even bringing this topic up and having this discussion with your little, maybe some of it just probing to see where his thoughts are on this, but then maybe going a little bit beyond that, maybe help him understand why he's seeing what he's seeing. Yeah,
no, I think hopefully once we come back in person, and then, you know, the other challenge for me with my little is I don't have direct access to his parents. You know, I forget who was mentioning it earlier, that it's good to have parent input because they set the parameters in maybe the conversation we have. And so I haven't had that opportunity, but I think moving forward, I definitely think this, because it impacts everybody. He may not see the direct impact, but I think it'll impact the way he sees, you know, the other kids in school or some of the kids in his neighborhood. And so even though he's white and I'm white, I mean, we're all part of the same community, if you think in those terms. And maybe one of the things I can do is with him is talking about differences and inclusiveness, and maybe even use possibly some other examples with him about being inclusive and being part of the larger community. And hopefully that will begin the conversation. But I do think it's important that everybody in the community, all our littles, at some point, we should have that conversation. And just to back up a little bit, I think it was Andrea was saying, you know, the Big Brothers, Big Sisters, they have some great resources, because these are going to be difficult conversations, especially if the big is white and the little's Black. So those resources you folks have on your website, I've gone through some of those. Those have been really, I think they're really powerful, and at least help us start those conversations. And then just having you folks as a backstop and give us some guidance in those conversations, I think that'll be really important.
And given that we have a number of people who are watching us right now, they're not able to actively participate, but they're listening to our conversation. Undoubtedly, either they or others who watch this recording afterwards may very well be in a situation you just described, Joe, of being a white big and having a Black or brown little. And that could make this conversation, especially with parents and also with the little themselves can make it more challenging. And I think that doesn't mean you get a bypass, you get a pass on that. I think that there's still a conversation that has to take place with the parents to see where they are in this issue and to let them know that you feel it's your responsibility as a big to at least broach the subject first with the parent or guardian and then with the little to at least see where they are and help them understand that because these things are not happening to you individually doesn't mean you're not a part of this whole society and that everyone plays a part. So I just wonder if others have any thoughts around that.
I do. I really like that what just came up, the idea of just because you're not going through something and you can't necessarily relate to the struggles that other people might relate to, doesn't mean that this conversation shouldn't be had. And I was taking notes while you guys were talking. One thing, the conversation of race is always challenging. It's challenging in the workplace. It's challenging in school. It's challenging in these contexts. Some of us have littles that are the same race as us. Some of us do not. But at the end of the day, I think that it's important for all people to treat people like people, regardless of the adjective, regardless of what color we are, regardless of who we love or what religion we practice. And as Americans, we claim so often that these are our principles, but we have a lot of trouble acting that out. And so I think that our role as bigs is to speak up and advocate for our littles, but also try to be a positive influence to them. It's nothing to teach a child or a young person in your life to value and respect people regardless of their demographics. And I think that, like I said, while that can be hard sometimes, the particulars and specifics can get a little blurred. If we keep that value at the forefront of our minds, I think that will carry us very far. And the second point I wanted to make, I know that earlier we mentioned the talk and having the talk with our littles who are males or Black and brown males. But I do want to just stress the point that Breonna Taylor was a 26-year-old Black woman. I'm a 25-year-old Black woman, so her case has hit me particularly differently as a fellow Louisville native. Girls are not exempt from the talk. Girls are not exempt from state sanctioned or police violence or systemic racism. Jennifer on this call has said that she has experienced one-on-one police violence. So I want to stress that these discussions are important for all littles, regardless of gender or gender expression, because none of them, especially those who are in minority communities, none of us are exempt. Thank you.
I would also chime in here too. I'm gonna let people in on a secret, whatever context your little has, they got you beat. You're never going to catch up. If they're 10 years old, they got a 10-year head start. They're 15, they got a 15-year head start. So if your concept is that I know more than my little about what my little is going through, you're wrong, number one. Number two, you should always be in the mind of making sure that whatever interaction you're having with your little is safe. And so that also includes psychological safety. So if you're little, and so I say that because you do not have control, because your little is in their own context, what they're dealing with in the moment. So if your little hits you over the head with something and you know it's heavy, then you need to say, hey, I got to pump my brakes. I don't want to step outside my bounds. I feel my own personal opinions or beliefs are coming up and I don't want to project those onto my little. And so these are moments where you say, hey, Andrea, I need backup. Hey, mom and dad, I need backup. Or hey, I want to talk to you about this little, but I think that we need to have this within the context, this conversation with, mom and dad or big brothers, big sisters personnel together. And so you can say, hey, let's make sure that we do this the right way and give yourself some time.
And I think you make a really important point there, Ramsey, and that is the whole point of this, the whole concept, having this conversation with the little is not so much to say, you have a problem and I've got the answer. It's more so to say, I understand you're having a difficult time with this, and our relationship is a safe place for us to talk about anything. Anything that you want to talk about, anything that's bothering you, this is a safe place. And maybe more to the point, we're not going to come away from this with an answer. We're going to come away from this with an experience of talking about this and realizing we can trust each other, talk about it, and maybe discover some things together. At the end of the day, the little may still have anxiety, and I'm sure they will, but they'll also know that you, as the big, are a safe person that they can talk to about this, and they can rely on you. And that's what's going to build up that foundation of a relationship with that little, and that's what carries on into the years going down the road. So, and Christian, you said two words that I want to go back to now in particular, Breonna Taylor. I know that we've been seeing, starting with George Floyd, don't ask me what it was about the George Floyd situation, because African-American men have been killed by police many years before and since, but there was something about that situation that somehow grabbed the world's attention and sort of got everyone talking about this. But if you want to make this Louisville specific, and we talk about Breonna Taylor, that too, that name is also going around the world. So what kind of teachable moments out of that situation do you think you can share with your little? Because that's close to home for them.
Well, although they're both tragedies in themselves, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, I think as a kid, my little said, where was the humanity? And I'm like, you know what? That's a good point, because basically with the George Floyd, there was no humanity. I mean, I needed help, so you taught that you need help to give help. So a police officer in that position should be giving help, actually is ending this guy's life. So he was kind of confused about that. Even my own grandson still is confused about that, which is kind of shocking. I try to explain them to him, like you said earlier, all police officers are not bad. Just the ones that, you know, are bad get on camera, unfortunately, which we have, and we got to, because it's televised and publicized through all kind of medias. So that's a situation where it goes way beyond George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And there was a situation in my own hometown, Rochester, New York, Dan, you proved that happened in March. They just brought out last, I believe last month, and he lives in the same city. So he's there, but it's gotta be more humanity to take care of a lot of things in the world as we see it every day.
And I guess if you take this whole topic of what happened with Breonna Taylor, initially it sounded like a police issue. A police officer either did or did not do something wrong, and the situation ensued. But now it's starting to unfold where there are other players involved. The Attorney General is involved, the grand jury is involved, what was said, what was not said, what instructions were given, how people were directed. And if your little is savvy enough to kind of understand all these little nuances in this case, what they could come away with is just mistrust of the entire system, mistrust of elected officials, mistrust of police, mistrust of anyone who looks different from them. So if you have a little who is not naturally expressive, not naturally communicative, especially around difficult issues, how can you draw their feelings out? I mean, once you've kind of cleared the runway with parents or guardians about what you're going to attempt to do and the boundaries for doing that, how can you draw them into a conversation, especially if your little's feeling uncomfortable about even discussing the topic?
So sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot. I don't want to, if anyone else wants to chime in, definitely feel free. But I am a writer. I'm a blogger, not by trade, but it's something that I just do to express myself. And my little is a bit more introverted than I am sometimes. So I try to channel things like that. Like, hey, let's do an activity where we both journal and just write down what's on your mind. And sometimes, you know, kids will automatically, things like this will work their way into those activities. If not, you could be even more direct and ask, you know, hey, there's a lot going on in our community right now. How about we both sit down and write down our feelings and then share with each other what we wrote down? And I think that could be a good catalyst to open conversations like that. Some people may use art. There are many different tools I think you can use, and I'm sure a match specialist could help with that as well if you are looking for something like that. But I wanted to bring up writing because I know a lot of kids express themselves that way, even when they don't feel like they want to verbally.
I think maybe one of the things to think about is that trying to broach the subject, especially if you have, very young kids where their language development's not real strong, but finding an interest that they really enjoy doing. So for example, if your little likes music, right? There's the lyrics, and going to Kristen's point that, that lyrics are words, and then using that as the conduit to beginning the conversations, or with, some young people like sports, whether it's basketball or baseball, whatever. But then, you might be able to bring in that sports, it was within my generation, or a little older than me, where sports were segregated, right? And it wasn't until Jackie Robinson, with the Brooklyn Dodgers, or even if you look at now that many of the players are minorities, but the owners are still white. And so the question is, maybe that's where you start having that conversation, because it's also about displacement of power within the community. So maybe using the thing that you and your little like to do together, and that's the jumping off point where you can start the conversation, around this issue.
We also have a comment from one of our panelists, Laura,
What did you say?
that says that what she's seen with her own child, who is 9 years old, a desperate need to feel heard and to take action. Her son's first reaction was, how can we stop what they're seeing? What can I do? Find opportunities to learn and read so we can all be allies to each other. So I guess the next question is that for those children who may be on the opposite end of those who are very quiet and maybe sheltered around this subject, you may have others who are very much on the other end. They've got a lot to say. They want to do something. They want to take advantage. They want to take action. What kinds of things can they do? And we've all seen, unfortunately, that even taking part in constitutionally guaranteed rights to have a peaceful protest sometimes ends tragically in the wrong way. But what kinds of things can we do to encourage our littles to become active in a positive way?
Tom, let me just interject really quick. I'm glad that Laura shared in our chat box here. We've got about 30 participants that are viewing our call today, so we definitely appreciate them being on too, like we were saying earlier. And if anybody has any questions or any comments they want to make, everyone is on mute. You are more than welcome to type into the chat box, and we'll definitely get those addressed. So thank you all so much. Sorry, go ahead.
So to answer, to respond to the question, I think one way is maybe teaching them how to be politically active, teaching them the importance of voting. Maybe that you can have them write postcards to their elected official, even though they can't vote yet, but showing them just how powerful that is to directly communicate with those people that can make some of these reforms and changes that we're asking for.
I think it's a great idea because it not only gets them active in being the whole political process, but lets them know this is a way to have your voice heard. And if there are enough voices who are echoing the same sentiments they are, that could sometimes result in change. I heard a quote from Bishop T.D. Jakes, and it was a very short quote, but someone asked the question, what do we do now? We have this period of protest and racial upheaval, but how do we progress beyond this? And what he said was, we have to find a way to move from protest to policy change. And maybe that's a conversation to have with our littles, is to talk about what things need to be changed, how are they changed, and maybe what role they could play, even though they are minor. What roles can they play in doing this? So we talked about how we can help littles express their feelings. One other thought that I had on that was, and I have encountered this, I guess, with my own grandson. You know, I mentioned Facebook, and he kind of laughed because in his world, Facebook is for old folks. So we know that our littles are probably very actively engaged in electronic communications, Instagram, and who knows, maybe that's passé now. You know, who knows what the latest thing is? Maybe it's a TikTok video, maybe it's something else. But have any of you seen your littles using those types of electronic communication vehicles to express themselves about anything? And is that a possible way a possible outlet for them to express themselves on this subject. Well, maybe not.
Audience
Well,
members, have any of your littles done that?
Kevin's rejoined us. Good.
Yeah, looks like I got kicked off.
I kind of had a comment on the last thing we were talking about before we start talking about social media. I think it's important that we understand that, you know, when our littles express some, they express interest or they express, you know, they're having some, you know, dissonance around these issues that are happening at the moment. You know, we as the adults, right, we have established ourselves in most situations. They are the ones who are coming up behind us, and they have to deal with this stuff, deal with the aftermath. So I think the policy piece is real big in teaching them how to engage with these issues that arise, so that as they are, you know, it's a part of their developmental process. But it is also very important that whatever they decide, if they say, hey, I want to go out to a protest, you say, well, you got to talk to your mom about that, or you talk to your dad about that, and we got to talk to the big brothers, big sisters people and let them know what's going on, you know. Don't just, you know, load them up and say, hey, let's go out there. Don't do that. I think that also the social media piece can be inflammatory. You know, I don't share social media with my little, and partially not because I'm doing nothing crazy on there, but I also don't want to be viewed as, you know, oh, my big's on here. I don't know what I can do. I don't want him to see. I don't want him to body or whatever is going on. I just think that you have to be mindful of, you know, when you're interacting with your little, is it in a way that they want to interact with you?
That's a very valid point. Andrew may have mentioned that I'm a former big myself, and I'm still in contact with my very first little. In fact, Andrew was our match specialist, and he's now in his early 20s, and I'm still in contact with him, even though we live hundreds of miles apart. But I asked him this very specific question because he still lives down in Louisville, and I asked him, obviously you're seeing what's going on all around you, and number one, are you safe? And number two, what are you doing in response to what you're seeing? Because clearly there are two different ways you can go with this. You can try to engage in peaceful protest. You can try to engage in positive change, try to support systemic change that maybe will alleviate the problem down the road. Or you can be among those who I've labeled opportunists, who are just taking advantage of the situation, the looters, the rioters, etc. And my personal opinion is that those two activities have nothing to do with the central issue. That these are people maybe not necessarily expressing rage, some may be, but I think most of them are just opportunists. And it makes it much more difficult for the real message and the real call for change to be heard, because that is what grabs the media's attention, and that's what's on the evening news every day. So, but you raised a very good point about being careful about how you interact and how you try to pull social media in. But again, just to kind of go back to the one of the things we started with, just talking about anxiety. You know, if your little has anxiety around this, how can we reduce those anxieties? What specific things can we do other than what we've already discussed that may help them deal with those anxieties? And is talking about it enough?
I think that one of the things we can do is just providing them a safe space to tell us what specifically is making them anxious. And then that can help us springboard into the conversation of how to curtail some of that. I'm also not connected with my little on social media. Perhaps when she's older, if we're still matched, you know, I may open that conversation with her then, but she's 13 right now. So I just I'm not doing anything crazy either, but like Ramsey said, you just want to be selective about that. What I will do though is encourage her, and I encourage all bigs to do this, encourage them to step away from the inflammatory stuff that's on social media. I, as an adult, throughout the pandemic and everything that's gone on this year, have had to take very conscious measures to make sure that I take a break from news and from the timelines and the social feeds, because it's always just constant stimulation there. And that does, after a while, start to affect your mental health, your emotions, and everything else. So I think that, providing them a space to talk about it openly, but also encouraging them to be mindful is equally important. And I really love what everyone has said about, trying to be exemplary and teaching them about the political process in a more hands-on way. Because I think there are plenty of adults out here that don't necessarily understand how government works, how decisions are made, how the legislative process works. If we can try to be a example for them to understand that better, I think that will make them into more productive and help them grow into adults who are passionate about civic engagement.
Couple of points, if I can just follow up. I know, sounds like the bigs, we don't have contact with the kids through social media, but that is the way a lot of them communicate with each other. So as becoming activists or empowering them is, if we can somehow connect them with like-minded people, with other young people who have similar experiences, that create what it does in my mind, it sees I'm not alone. And sometimes they might feel better if we're going to, contact our legislator or our councilman. So trying to find like-minded young people who have maybe a similar passion, I think is the helpful way. And sometimes social media, it could be a double-edged sword, but that's one of the ways kids communicate. And Tom, you're right on point when you say FaceTime, Facebook. That's for people with gray hair like us, or like me anyway.
No hair like me.
Yeah, well, then the other thing is just about kids being anxious and anxiety. I think as a big is we need to try and normalize those feelings for them and say, it's okay to feel anxious. It's okay to be, have anxiety, and then knowing maybe what some of the triggers are, that triggers that anxiety. And then maybe even just coming up with a plan. If you're able to share a story of yourself, are there times when you become anxious or your anxiety level goes up? Because I think that will make, if you can share your own story where you feel anxious, oh, Tom feels anxious, so then it's okay for me to have that feeling. Because I think sometimes they're looking towards adults for affirmation to have that feeling or not, right? So being anxious is okay. But what do we do with that then? And when do we recognize, like, what are the symptoms of being anxious or anxiety? And then what can we do to maybe teach them some strategies to deal with anxiety, empowering them? So that's the way to go. But the important piece is affirming and recognizing it's okay to feel anxious. It's a normal reaction to what's going on in our world, in our community right now. And it's almost like a relief when we say that to them, because you're validating their feelings. That's an important thing to think about.
I also want to. No, I was actually going to say Ramsey could probably speak to this better than I can, but we also have to recognize, as we're having these conversations, that we may not be the right person to have this conversation with them. So research tells us, especially inner city children, they suffer from PTSD rates higher than veterans returning from war. And so for some of these children, bringing up these issues might actually cause more harm, and we have to be prepared to recognize that and have a conversation with their parent about maybe the possibility of seeing someone who is more qualified to talk about these mental health triggers and these issues and these anxieties than we are.
Ramsey, you were going to make a point?
Yeah, I think that was a great point, Jennifer. I was going to say something about, Tom, you brought up a topic about opportunists, and it rang true with me. I think that there's another category, though. It's like you have political opportunists, right? So people who are spinning narratives to increase anxiety, right? And so back to what Jennifer said, you don't want to be that person, right? You don't want to be the person who is increasing the anxiety for your little by saying, well, these people are bad, these people are good, pushing them to pushing their view of the topic to extremes is what I want to say. And so I think it's best practice to dwell in reality and be someone who and reinforces, facts, right? So if the fact is, yes, there are people protesting, they are out there because they see that Black people are experiencing disproportional violence, and it's coming from law enforcement and authority, and these are the facts, you know, and make sure that kind of dispel anything, any other, these opinions, these political opportunists who are spinning their narratives into something else.
Now, I know we just have a couple minutes left, and let me just say this. We've been so focused up to this point on how we can take care of our littles. Jennifer, you mentioned something that just resonated with me. We also have to find a way to take care of ourselves. Because unless we are in a good place, we can't be in a good place for our littles. And in the couple minutes that we have left, I'm going to kind of go around to each of you individually and ask, what kinds of things, or what is your source of hope for the future? And how do we pass that hope on to our littles? And Jennifer, I'm going to pick on you because you're on the top of my screen. So I'm going to start with you in just a couple seconds.
So where do I get my hope? It may sound cliche, but I think that my hope comes from younger people. I'm so excited by Gen Z and their push for social justice that I think my hope comes from them. And I hope that I can teach my little that he has the power to change things in this world through positive mechanisms.
Great, thank you. Kevin, how about you? What is your source of hope, and how do you convey that? How can you convey that to your little?
I got to agree with Jennifer 100%. Hope is in the generations below us. My little is going to be doing big things. I could just see it. And I see him, he's just like a sponge. He wants to learn everything. He wants to know everything. And some things I can't keep up with him. So I see hope in the younger generation. And I agree with Jennifer 100%.
Thank you. Joe.
Yeah, just to echo what Kevin and Jennifer were saying, just what we're seeing on TV and in the media, where the young people are active in the peaceful protest, I think that's really good. But then also having a voice, you know, in the larger context that with the election in about 3 days from now or 4 days from now, the group that's probably having the biggest increase in voting right now, in early voting, are young people. They're people under the age of 30. And to me, that's so encouraging because, you know, if they can feel empowered, because whatever's going to happen, it's going to happen to me, but I'm not going to be around, you know, as long as they are. So I'm very encouraged that we're seeing across the nation an increase in young people taking an interest in their communities and what's going on and voting at higher rates, because they've always been one of the populations where they had the lowest rates of engagement when you talk about voting.
Thank you, Joe. How about Ramsey? In the few seconds we have left.
Yeah, there's an old saying that says, do as I say, not as I do. And I'm hopeful because I always know that young people, when they hear that, they know like, oh, okay, you're talking some nonsense. So my hope is that, and my is around them being able to decipher, you know, truth in these moments that we're living.
And last but not least, Christian.
Yes, so I get my hope from the saying, be the change that you wish to see. And I try to pass that sentiment on to young people because I too believe that true change is coming with Generation Z. I love their passion and I love their commitment to really wanting to change things and being hands-on with that. The other thing I would say is there is power in your voice, use it. And I think that's something that we can all stand to remember and pass on to each other.
And I will echo what one of our attendees just said in a comment, that they get their hope from the fact that there are bigs like all of you on the panel and all of you who are watching. So I know we're at the end of our hour. I just want to say thank you to you 5 panelists. This has been excellent. And this is the beginning of a dialogue, but certainly not the end. I'm sure that I'll be in contact with Andrea, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Kentuckiana, to figure out how we can follow this up with more information for bigs, for littles, and hopefully we'll get to the point where we can look back on this and talk about all the things we learned from it and have a stronger relationship with our littles as a result. Andrea? I think you're muted, Andrew.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much, panelists, for joining us and for all of your words of encouragement and inspiration. And thank you, audience members out there today as well. Before we go, do any audience members have any final questions to ask the panel? You can type those in the chat box really quick, and we'll do our best to answer those before we finish the call up. Just didn't want to miss anyone. All right. I'm seeing a lot of thank yous. Yes, Emily, we can definitely do this again. We're planning to do more trainings in the future in the coming months, so stay tuned with your match support specialist and with our staff, and we'll definitely keep you posted. So, all right, looks like Jerry has also included our website with information on our diversity, equity, and inclusion. All right, I don't see any additional questions coming in, so again, thank you all so much for spending your evening with us, and thank you for the difference that you make in the lives of your littles and your families that you work with. You all make such an incredible difference, so we thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.